There is a desert on the southwestern coast of Africa that has been dry, without meaningful interruption, for somewhere between 55 and 80 million years. It was already a desert when dinosaurs were still walking the earth. In its most arid stretches, the Namib receives as little as 2 millimeters of rain in an entire year, and across the country as a whole, average population density sits at around 4 people per square kilometer, one of the emptiest, least hospitable landscapes any nation has ever tried to call home. And yet, Namibia pulls hundreds of thousands of tons of food out of that same land and out of the ocean beside it every single year. Enough to export grapes to European supermarkets, beef to 5 countries, and fish across the world, from a country most people couldn't place on a map. Set that against the country's own population, roughly 3 million people, spread across a landmass bigger than Texas, and you get one of the emptiest ratios of people to land found anywhere on Earth. None of that makes obvious sense. A desert this old, this dry, this empty of people, should not be feeding anyone beyond itself, let alone shipping food outward. This is the story of how a handful of very different bets, one buried underground for 10,000 years, one planted beside a river in 1988, one floating in a cold ocean current that seems built to punish the coastline instead of feed it, turned one of the driest, oldest landscapes on the planet into a working food system, and how, as recently as last year, that same country was formally taken off the United Nations list of the world's hungriest places. Start with just how much land we're actually talking about. Namibia covers roughly 824,000 square kilometers, larger than Texas, more than twice the size of Germany. And a meaningful share of that territory is the Namib itself, stretching over 2,000 kilometers along the Atlantic coastline and covering some 80,000 square kilometers of dune, gravel plain, and bare rock. Rainfall across the country ranges from an almost unbelievable 5 millimeters a year in the eastern interior up to 85 millimeters in the wetter western strip. For comparison, a single heavy thunderstorm in a temperate country can drop that much rain in an afternoon. And the reason it stays that dry isn't simple bad luck. A cold current running north along the coast, the Benguela, chills the air sitting above it and locks it in place. So the warm, moist air that would normally rise and form rain clouds simply never gets the chance. The same current that starves the desert of rain is, as it turns out, the reason the ocean right next to it is so unusually alive. A detail worth holding on to, because it becomes one of the central turns in this story. Against that backdrop, the actual production numbers get stranger the closer you look at them. Namibia's fishing fleets pull in close to 400,000 tons of fish a year, mostly hake and horse mackerel, out of waters fed by that same current. Beef exports surged past 22,700 tons in 2024 alone, a 44% jump from the year before, headed to the European Union, South Africa, the UK, Norway, and China. A single valley on the country's southern border produces around 33,000 tons of table grapes a year, timed to hit European supermarket shelves 3 to 5 weeks before any of Namibia's Southern Hemisphere competitors. None of these are numbers you'd expect from a country this dry, this empty, and this short on rain. And none of them explain how a nation that can't reliably grow enough of its own grain to feed itself is somehow also an exporter on 3 different fronts at once. Because underneath every one of those export numbers sits an uncomfortable fact this country has never fully escaped. Namibians consume roughly 302,000 tons of grain a year, and domestic production has almost never come close to matching it. Some years landing as low as 18,000 tons, other years closer to 155,000, always leaving a gap that has to be imported. That gap is closer to the structural default than a temporary dip. Namibia simply doesn't have enough reliably rain-fed land in the right places, at the right time of year, to grow the grain its own population eats. And that has been true across decades of records, not just one bad season. A country can export beef, grapes, and fish, and still not be able to reliably grow its own bread. That gap gets closed the unglamorous way, through commercial grain imports and, in bad years, direct food aid, both of which cost money and depend on functioning ports, roads, and a government able to plan and pay for the shortfall well before anyone actually goes hungry. A country that has to import a third or more of its staple grain most years isn't failing at agriculture so much as running a permanent, structural balancing act between three unrelated food systems: export crops grown for foreign currency, subsistence farming grown for survival, and imported grain paid for by whatever the first two bring in. There's a second layer underneath even that, and it has nothing to do with rainfall at all. Namibia's agricultural land is split between two systems that rarely intersect. Roughly 10,500 privately owned commercial farms concentrated in the central and southern regions, and around 250,000 rural households farming communally owned land, mostly in the country's northern communal areas, a divide with roots stretching back to colonial-era land policy, and one that still shapes who exports grapes to Germany and who ends up on a food insecurity list when the rains fail. Export agriculture and subsistence food security, in other words, are largely two separate economies wearing the same national flag. That gap is the wall this story runs into next. Drought in this part of the world is not a rare event. It is closer to the default condition, interrupted occasionally by rain. Colonial-era records describe a long, punishing drought and famine across central Namibia in 1877, and another multi-year drought stretching from 1894 to 1899 that ranks among the most severe the wider Kalahari region experienced in the entire 19th century. This is not a country caught off guard by dryness. It is a country that has had to build its entire relationship with food around the near certainty that the rain, most years, simply will not come in sufficient quantity. That relationship was tested about as hard as it could be in 2024. An El Niño-driven drought pushed conditions to what officials described as the worst in 100 years. And on May 22nd of that year, then-President Nangolo Mbumba declared a national state of emergency over hunger. Close to 385,000 households were declared food insecure. In the hardest-hit region, Omaheke, more than 1,100 Namibians, most of them children, died from causes linked to malnutrition. Numbers like that are easy to read past quickly. They shouldn't be. Every one of those deaths happened inside a country that, in the very same years, was simultaneously shipping thousands of tons of beef and grapes overseas, proof that having an export industry and having food security for your own population are not automatically the same achievement, and that this country's food system, however impressive on paper, was still capable of failing the people standing closest to it. The question this story has to answer, then, isn't simply, how does anyone grow food in a desert this old and this dry? It's a harder one. How does a country with a documented, repeating, centuries-long pattern of drought and hunger go from declaring a 100-year state of emergency in 2024 to being formally removed from the world's list of hunger hotspots barely a year later? Getting there took three very different bets, made over three very different timescales, by three very different kinds of people. And the first of them had been sitting underground, unknown to anyone, for roughly 10,000 years. In 2012, a joint team of hydrogeologists surveying northern Namibia, near the border with Angola, confirmed something that changed the water math for nearly half the country overnight. A massive underground reservoir, now known as the Ohangwena II aquifer, stretching roughly 70 by 40 kilometers on the Namibian side of the border. Preliminary estimates suggested it held enough water to supply northern Namibia, an area home to around 40% of the country's entire population, for approximately 400 years at then-current usage rates. Tests on the water itself turned up something almost as strange as the volume. It's estimated to be up to 10,000 years old, trapped underground since a wetter ancient climate recharged it, and yet it's clean enough that it requires only minimal treatment before it's safe to drink. Cleaner, by some measures, than water coming out of far more modern systems elsewhere in the world. A country that had spent its entire recorded history negotiating with an empty sky had, without knowing it, been sitting on top of an ancient answer the whole time. For families in the villages sitting directly above it, the practical difference was immediate and physical. Water that used to mean a walk of several hours to a seasonal pan, or a hand-dug well that might already be dry, started arriving instead through a tap connected to a borehole and a pipeline network. The same 10,000-year-old water, delivered like an ordinary utility bill rather than a daily gamble. The second bet looked nothing like the first, because it didn't come from a government survey team at all. It came from someone willing to gamble on a piece of land nobody else wanted. In 1988, an investor acquired a derelict vegetable farm at a spot called Ausenkirch, on the banks of the Orange River in the far south, in a stretch of the Namib receiving less than 50 millimeters of rain a year. Desert by any definition. What made the location valuable wasn't the desert at all. It was the river running through it, and the fact that Ausenkirch's particular combination of heat and timing let grapes ripen 3 to 5 weeks earlier than competing growing regions in the Southern Hemisphere. That head start turned into the single biggest lever available to a small producer trying to compete in a global market. Hit European shelves before anyone else does, and command a premium for it. Today, Ausenkirch carries over 1,200 hectares of vineyards, producing around 33,000 tons of grapes a year, with roughly 70% of that crop exported directly to the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany, turning one derelict farm into a genuine, if imperfect, thread in Europe's supermarket supply chain, entirely dependent on a single river cutting through an otherwise lifeless stretch of sand. The third bet wasn't a discovery or an investment at all. It was a fact the country had been sitting next to the entire time without fully cashing in on it. That same cold Benguela current responsible for strangling rainfall along the coast turns out to be doing something very different underwater. Cold currents like the Benguela pull nutrient-rich water up from the ocean depths, and that upwelling feeds an enormous food chain, supporting some of the richest fishing grounds anywhere on the African coastline. Hake and horse mackerel alone account for more than 90% of everything Namibian boats bring in, and total production sits close to 400,000 tons a year. Meaning the exact same atmospheric mechanism that makes the Namib the driest, oldest desert on the planet is, without any contradiction at all, the reason the ocean beside it is unusually alive. The curse and the resource turned out to be running on the same current. It's a strange kind of symmetry. The exact same cold water pressing against the coastline that keeps rain clouds from ever forming over the Namib is, at the same moment, dragging nutrients up from the ocean floor and feeding one of the densest concentrations of commercially valuable fish anywhere on the African coast. Stand on a dune above the Namib at sunrise, and everything about the view says nothing could possibly grow here. Look straight out to sea from that same dune, and the water directly in front of you is quietly doing the opposite. But that resource almost didn't survive long enough to matter. Before Namibia's independence in 1990, foreign fishing fleets worked these same waters under no meaningful, sustainable management regulation at all, and the hake stocks that had made the coastline famous were badly overexploited by the time Namibia became a country in its own right. Independence gave Namibia a tool it had never had before: control over its own waters. The new Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources declared a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone specifically to push foreign fleets back out, and then did something that ran directly against short-term economic interest. It drastically cut the hake catch quota for 2 straight years, 1990 and 1991, deliberately taking a hit to let the resource start recovering before allowing catch limits to creep back upward from 1992 on. A newly independent country, in genuine need of export revenue, chose to catch less fish on purpose. That decision is the reason there was still a hake fishery left to build the rest of this story around. Not every bet this country made is paid off, and the honest version of this story has to sit with the one that hasn't. Namibia's biggest single infrastructure wager was the Neckartal Dam, greenlit on a 2010 feasibility study that priced it at roughly 2.4 billion Namibian dollars. By the time it was actually finished in 2019, the real cost had climbed to somewhere around 5.7 billion, more than double the original estimate, commonly reported in Namibian press as closer to 3 times the price anyone had signed up for, after a high court dispute during construction let the contractor demand an extra 600 million on top. The dam itself, Namibia's largest by far, was formally inaugurated in 2020, designed to eventually irrigate up to 5,000 hectares of cash crops and produce, with expansion as much as 20,000. As of the most recent reporting available, more than 6 years after completion, it has stood mostly full and largely unused, described bluntly in one Namibian newspaper as, so far, nothing more than a source of water vapor and a tourist attraction. Officials estimate another 2.4 to 3.9 billion Namibian dollars in additional investment is still needed before commercial irrigation can even begin. And as recently as this year, one outlet flatly stated that commercial use of the dam remains not yet in sight. A country can spend more on a single dam than most of its other food bets combined, and still end up with, in the words of one local critic, not a single dollar earned from it yet. The success stories carry their own honest asterisks, too. Reporting from investigative journalists at Ausencare has documented genuinely harsh living and working conditions for the migrant laborers who pick the grapes that make it onto European shelves. A reminder that an export success story, and a fair one, aren't automatically the same thing, and that the workers closest to the fruit rarely see the premium prices it earns overseas. And even the good news buried underground carries a quiet catch. An aquifer holding water for 400 years sounds close to permanent, right up until you remember that fossil water, recharged only under a climate that no longer exists, is not renewable on any timescale a human being can plan around. 400 years is an extraordinary gift. It is also, eventually, a countdown. Namibia's own water authorities are aware of exactly this tension, which is why extraction from the aquifer has generally been managed as a supplement to, rather than a replacement for, surface water sources in the north. A hedge against the uncomfortable possibility that 400 years, on a long enough timeline, is not actually 400 years if usage climbs faster than anyone currently expects. Even the fishery's recovery, real as it was, turned out to be partial rather than complete. Research into the post-independence hake fishery found that stocks did show some rebound after 2007, but remain at only around 1/3 of what the resource could sustainably support at its modeled maximum, a level not far removed from where it stood back in 1990. Part of the reason? Namibia's own post-independence push to increase domestic ownership and participation in the industry, a policy generally seen as a national success, also increased overall fishing effort and pushed stocks back down below their most economically efficient level. Cutting the quota in 1990 and 1991 saved the fishery from collapse. It did not, on its own, restore it to full health, and more than 3 decades later, it still hasn't. And every one of these bets is being made against a climate that is not standing still. Southern Africa's El Niño-linked droughts, like the one Namibia declared a state of emergency over in 2024, are broadly expected by climate scientists to grow more frequent across the region in the decades ahead. Which means the margin for error on an aquifer with a 400-year clock, a river-fed valley dependent on upstream flow, and a fish quota already sitting at 1/3 of its healthy level, is not likely to get any more forgiving from here. Strip away the politics and the controversy, and what's actually happening on the ground across these 3 bets is worth walking through directly, because none of it looks anything like a single, unified system. It looks like 3 completely separate operations that happen to be running in the same country at the same time. At Ausencare, the mechanics are almost defiantly simple. Pumps draw water directly from the Orange River into a network of drip irrigation lines threaded through more than 1,200 hectares of vines, delivering just enough moisture, exactly where it's needed, to keep grapevines alive in a stretch of desert that would otherwise support nothing more than scattered scrub. Workers move through the rows during the growing season, pruning, thinning, and eventually hand-harvesting the crop at the precise moment that lets it beat competing regions to European markets by 3 to 5 weeks, before trucking the crop south to Cape Town's ports for the journey to Rotterdam, Southampton, and Hamburg. A timing advantage that only exists because of where the farm happens to sit on the map, not because of any special technology. In the north, the Ohangwena II aquifer works on an entirely different logic. Rather than one dramatic pumping operation, water is drawn up through boreholes distributed across the aquifer's footprint and fed into pipeline networks that reach villages and towns across a region home to roughly 40% of the country's population, turning what used to be a constant, grinding search for surface water, often a walk of hours to the nearest seasonal pan or hand-dug well, into something closer to an ordinary utility service, at least for as long as the underground reserve holds out. And out on the water, the fishing industry runs on a completely different kind of process, built around limits instead of machinery. Management. Namibia sets an annual total allowable catch for its key species, 270,000 tons of horse mackerel alone in 2024, down from 330,000 tons just 2 years earlier. A quota trend moving in the wrong direction that the country has to actively manage rather than simply harvest against. Boats work against that ceiling all year, landing hake and horse mackerel that account for the overwhelming majority of everything Namibia pulls from the sea, in waters made unusually productive by the very same cold current that keeps the coastline dry. Before the catch is processed and frozen at coastal plants in Walvis Bay and Lüderitz for export. There's a fourth process running alongside those three, and it only switches on when the other three aren't enough on their own. During the 2024 crisis, households in affected regions had to register and get verified as food insecure before receiving a voucher redeemable specifically at one of nearly 500 contracted retailers, rather than a straightforward cash handout. A system designed to get food moving through existing local shops, rather than standing up a parallel government distribution network from scratch. By June 2025, close to 145,000 households had gone through that exact process. It's the slowest and least glamorous of the 4 systems in this story, built to activate only when the river, the aquifer, and the ocean, between them, still aren't putting enough food on enough tables. Between them, that's 4 systems, 4 completely different mechanisms. River pumps, underground boreholes, ocean quotas, none of them talking to each other, none of them part of some grand coordinated plan. And yet together, they're what stands between this country and the kind of hunger crisis it was declaring a national emergency over as recently as 2024. What's actually interesting about Namibia's approach, once you step back from any single one of these projects, is that it never bet everything on one solution. A government-backed megadam, a privately financed river farm, a scientifically discovered aquifer, and a naturally productive ocean current are 4 completely different kinds of risk, running on 4 completely different timelines, funded by 4 completely different sources of money, and only some of them have actually delivered yet. That's not obviously smart planning. In places, it looks more like accumulated improvisation, decades of separate actors solving separate problems without much coordination between them. But diversification, even the accidental kind, has a way of surviving failure that a single grand plan doesn't. When the Neckartal Dam sat unused for 6 years, the country wasn't left entirely without options, because Ausencare's grapes and Namibia's fishing fleets never depended on that dam succeeding in the first place. A single mega-project failing is a real setback. A single mega-project failing in a system that also has an ancient aquifer, a river farm, and an ocean current still working is survivable, in a way that a country betting on the dam alone would not have been. It's also worth being honest about how much of the 2025 recovery came down to genuine human effort versus simple good fortune. The government's response to the 2024 crisis was real and substantial. A $1.3 billion Namibian drought relief plan running from July 2024 through June 2025, delivering food assistance, livestock support, seed and horticulture provision, water access, and a food voucher system that saw close to 145,000 households redeem support at nearly 500 contracted retailers. But officials themselves, along with the UN agencies that made the final call, attributed Namibia's recovery to a combination of that policy response and a genuine return of favorable rainfall, not to policy success alone. The honest version of this story gives credit to both, in roughly that order. Real institutional effort, backed up by a year the sky finally cooperated. Put the pieces next to each other, and the turnaround is hard to overstate. In May 2024, Namibia was declaring the worst drought in a century, a national state of emergency, close to 385,000 food-insecure households, and over 1,100 deaths tied to malnutrition. By July 2025, just over a year later, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme officially removed Namibia from the United Nations Global Hunger Hotspot list entirely, alongside regional neighbors Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. That list is a joint early warning classification the FAO and WFP publish periodically, naming the countries at the highest and most urgent risk of worsening food crises, specifically so that aid and attention go to the right places before a crisis peaks rather than after. Coming off it isn't a formality. It's the two organizations most responsible for tracking global hunger, stating, on the record, that this particular emergency is no longer the most urgent one on their list. That recovery sits on top of a food system that, however imperfect, is genuinely producing at real scale for a country this dry and this empty. Close to 400,000 tons of fish a year, pulled from waters fed by the same current that keeps the desert bone dry. More than 22,700 tons of beef exported to 5 different countries in 2024 alone. Over 13,200 tons to the European Union, 4,200 tons to South Africa, 3,100 tons to the UK, 1,600 tons to Norway, and close to 500 tons even as far away as China. Roughly 33,000 tons of grapes shipped to European supermarkets weeks ahead of the competition, and a 400-year buffer of ancient water sitting beneath the north, discovered by accident just over a decade ago. None of those numbers individually adds up to the kind of round, headline figure that makes for an easy comparison. This is not Brazil or Argentina, and Namibia's own agricultural sector has openly acknowledged that what this country produces in a year, the world's true agricultural giants produce in a month. But taken together, fish, beef, grapes, ancient groundwater, and a still-developing dam project that hasn't delivered yet, this is a country whose combined food output, across land and sea, now runs into the high hundreds of thousands of tons every single year, produced by one of the oldest, driest, and most sparsely populated landscapes on the planet, by a population smaller than a single mid-sized city, spread across a country bigger than Texas. None of Namibia's real solutions involved beating the desert. Nobody figured out how to make the Namib rain more, or found a way to make the Benguela current stop chilling the coastline. Every genuine win in this story came from working with what the land and the ocean were already doing. Pumping from a river that was always going to keep flowing. Tapping water the ground had been quietly holding on to for 10,000 years. And harvesting a fishery that a cold, rain-killing current had been feeding the entire time without anyone asking it to. The desert never got any less old, or any less dry, or any less indifferent to the roughly 3 million people trying to build a life on top of it. What changed was that enough different people, working on different timelines with different amounts of money, found enough different cracks in that indifference to build something durable out of them. A hydrogeologist's survey team, an investor willing to gamble on a derelict farm in 1988, a newly independent government willing to catch less fish on purpose in 1990, and a drought relief program willing to hand out food vouchers by the 100,000 in 2024. None of them were working toward the same goal, or even aware of each other's work half the time. That's arguably the real lesson sitting underneath all of it. A country doesn't need one perfect answer to an ancient problem. It needs enough different, uncoordinated people, willing to take enough different, uncoordinated risks, that at least a few of them are still standing when the rain doesn't come. Durable enough, in the end, to take a country off the world's list of its hungriest places within about a year of declaring its worst drought in a century. If stories like this, where the harshest, least forgiving places on Earth turn out to have unexpected ways of feeding themselves, are your kind of thing, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.